Just one man, one BMW M5, and the streets of Tbilisi as his racetrack. That man was Giorgi Tevzadze, the drift king of Georgia. Back in 2013, this video hit YouTube and went viral, racking up over 10 million views. Giorgi wasn't just fast, he was surgical. Every drift, every slide through traffic was perfect. But here's the thing, legends like this never last. And for Giorgi, the same streets that made him famous would soon become the ones that took everything away. The culture that built a drift king. Understanding why Giorgi became the drift king of Georgia requires understanding what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Georgia went from being part of a superpower to complete chaos almost overnight. 4 armed conflicts broke out within the first few years of independence. The economy collapsed so hard that the national currency became basically worthless. Civil strikes shut down entire cities. The government cycled through authoritarian leaders who couldn't maintain basic order. For people who grew up in that environment, the idea of following rules felt meaningless because the rules kept changing depending on who had power that week. And in the middle of all that chaos, something interesting started happening. Used German cars, especially BMWs, started flooding into Georgia from Western Europe. Western Europe cycles through cars incredibly fast. A BMW that's only 3 or 4 years old in Germany gets sold off cheap and shipped east to countries like Georgia, where people are desperate for reliable vehicles. For Georgians who had spent their entire lives driving Soviet-made cars that struggled to hit 60 miles per hour and handled like shopping carts, getting behind the wheel of a used BMW M5 wasn't just an upgrade, it was stepping into a completely different reality. These cars became instant status symbols. Owning a BMW meant you had figured out how to succeed in the new capitalist system. It meant you had money, connections, and the ability to navigate a world that was still figuring out its own rules. And for young men who had grown up surrounded by violence and instability, driving these cars recklessly became a form of rebellion against a system that had failed them for their entire lives. Georgian traffic enforcement in the 2000s was almost non-existent. Police were underfunded, poorly trained, and dealing with corruption at every level. Even after major reforms started in 2003 under President Saakashvili's government, traffic violations were mostly handled with fines. There was no point system, no license suspensions for repeat offenders. You just paid the fine when you got caught and moved on. Giorgi was born in 1987 in Tbilisi and spent part of his childhood in Russia before returning to Georgia. He got behind the wheel of a car for the first time at 13 years old. And by his mid-20s, he had become the undisputed center of Georgia's illegal street drifting scene. He wasn't just good at driving, he was surgical with it. Every gap between cars was threaded with precision. Every drift was controlled. Every lane change was calculated 3 moves ahead. But car culture alone doesn't create viral videos with 22 million views. Something else was happening in the early 2000s that made Giorgi's timing perfect. YouTube was exploding as a platform, and Eastern Europe had developed its own version of Fast and Furious culture through movies that glorified exactly the kind of driving Giorgi was doing in real life. Movies like Taxi, The Transporter, and German shows like Alarm for Cobra. 11 had been dubbed into Russian and Georgian, and were playing on repeat across the entire region. These weren't just action movies, they were instruction manuals for a generation of young drivers who saw high-speed chases through traffic as the ultimate form of self-expression. And when YouTube made it possible to film that lifestyle and share it with the world, Giorgi and his friends saw an opportunity that nobody else in Georgia was taking seriously. They called their YouTube channel Need for Drive, borrowing the name and lettering style from the Need for Speed video game franchise. They didn't just upload dash cam footage of street races, they produced full documentaries with professional cinematography, carefully selected soundtracks, and editing that would make most film students jealous. This wasn't amateur hour, this was a calculated effort to turn illegal street racing into a legitimate media brand. and for a while it looked like it was going to work. The video that made Giorgi Tevzadze internationally famous dropped on April 19, 2013. It opened with two BMW M5s, his dark purple E34 and a red one driven by a friend, racing through the packed streets of Tbilisi during rush hour. The driving footage was genuinely insane. Giorgi and his friend were weaving between commuter cars at over 100 miles per hour, drifting through intersections with pedestrians standing 10 feet away and at one point driving directly into oncoming traffic while police cars sat parked on the side of the road watching it happen. The skill on display was undeniable. These weren't kids with a death wish. These were drivers who had spent over a decade mastering their craft.
Меня знаешь, что удивляет? Вы видите патрульную тачку, ты замираешь буквально на 1,5 секунды просто для того, чтобы сказать «патруль!» и все, и потом опять вот это начинается!
But the video showed something deeper than just reckless driving. It gave viewers a window into Georgian life that felt completely foreign to anyone watching from outside the country. Orthodox churches appearing in the background of drift sequences, scenes of Giorgi and his friends drinking heavily between runs, mountain roads covered in snow where they practiced drifting in conditions that would terrify professional rally drivers. The entire thing had this melancholic atmosphere that separated it from every other street racing video on YouTube. The video exploded. Within weeks, it had millions of views. Comment sections filled up with people from Russia, Europe, and the United States trying to figure out who this guy was and how he wasn't dead or in prison yet. Motorcycle forums and car culture websites started dissecting every frame of the video looking for clues about how the Georgian street racing scene actually worked. And Giorgi was ready to capitalize on it. In an interview with Reuters published in April 2013, just weeks after the video dropped, he made it clear that this wasn't just a hobby anymore. He told the reporter that he wasn't trying to scare anyone. He wanted to attract attention from Hollywood. He wanted to open an extreme driving school in Georgia where he could teach people how to handle dangerous situations on the road safely and legally. He wanted to turn everything he'd built underground into a legitimate business.
Zauważeni przez kogoś z Hollywood, gdyby zaproponowali nam pracę, moglibyśmy robić wszystko. Jesteśmy przygotowani na każdy najbardziej ekstremalny scenariusz przy największych prędkościach.
When the Reuters reporter asked him about legal trouble, Giorgi's answer was telling. He admitted that he was regularly fined by traffic police, but he also said that he still legally had his driver's license and that the videos were shot quite a long time ago, so he didn't see them as a legal problem. His logic was simple. If police couldn't prove he was the driver during a specific violation, then posting old footage wasn't technically illegal. That was the same logic ghostwriter used in Sweden a decade earlier. Film everything. Release it after the statute of limitations starts running out. Stay ahead of the system long enough to retire on your own terms. But Giorgi wasn't operating in Sweden. He was operating in Georgia, where the rules were changing fast. By 2013, Georgian traffic enforcement had improved dramatically compared to the chaos of the 1990s and early 2000s. Police were better funded. Corruption had been reduced significantly under the Saakashvili government's reforms, and international attention was forcing the country to take traffic safety more seriously if it wanted to be seen as a legitimate European nation instead of a lawless post-Soviet backwater. Sources from the time confirmed that police were stopping Giorgi constantly to check his documents. His car was too recognizable. His face was too famous. Every time he got behind the wheel, there was a chance he'd get pulled over just because police knew who he was and what he represented. The fines were piling up, and while Giorgi claimed in his Reuters interview that he still had his license, other sources suggest that might not have been entirely true. According to reports that surfaced after his death, Giorgi's driver's license had been confiscated by authorities for dangerous driving while making his videos. The exact timeline is unclear, and Giorgi's April interview contradicts this, but what's certain is that the legal pressure was increasing. The viral success that was supposed to launch his career was actually making it impossible for him to keep doing what made him famous in the first place. Think about the position he was in. 22 million views, international media attention, talks about Hollywood deals and legitimate business opportunities. But every time he drove his car, he risked getting stopped by police who were now under public pressure to do something about the guy making Georgia look like a country with no traffic laws. Ghostwriter in Sweden could release DVDs for a decade because Swedish law required physical identification during an actual violation. Giorgi was operating in a system where the rules were murkier, enforcement was inconsistent, and viral fame was forcing authorities to make an example out of someone they'd ignored for years. The hunt wasn't a chase, it was a clock ticking down. And Giorgi had 2 months between viral success and finding out how that hunt would end. The crash and what it meant. On June 22, 2013, around 3 a.m., Giorgi was sitting in the passenger seat of his black BMW M5 on a winding road near Batumi, Georgia. His friend was driving. They were coming down a section of road they'd probably driven hundreds of times before. According to witnesses, they were maybe 40 meters from their destination when the car skidded, lost control, and slammed into a tree at full speed. The passenger side took the main impact. Here's a look at a reconstruction of the accident. Giorgi died instantly. His friend survived. There was no alcohol involved, according to Eric Davidovich, a well-known Moscow street racer who witnessed the aftermath and confirmed the driver was sober. It was just a skid that went wrong at the worst possible moment. 26 years old, recently married, 13 years of driving experience, viral success that was supposed to launch a legitimate career, plans for an extreme driving school, talks about Hollywood deals. All of it ended on a road in Batumi while he wasn't even behind the wheel. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Giorgi had survived years of threading through traffic at over 100 miles per hour. He'd survived drifting on icy mountain roads in conditions that would kill most professional drivers. He'd survived every single high-risk maneuver that was captured on camera and watched by millions of people. And then he died as a passenger in a routine crash on a road he probably knew by heart. Public reaction split immediately. Some people said it was inevitable. That reckless driving always catches up eventually, and Giorgi's death was proof that you can't cheat physics forever. Others mourned him as a genuinely talented driver who could have been a motorsport star if he'd been born in a country with better infrastructure and more opportunities. Folk hero or cautionary tale, legend or criminal. Nobody could agree, but here's what nobody could argue. Giorgi died before he found out what the hunt was actually going to look like. He died before court proceedings could play out, before police could build a case strong enough to take his license permanently or put him in jail, before the viral fame could either destroy him or launch the legitimate career he was planning. A lot of tributes were made, and here's a quick look into one of many. His friends proved the model worked. Eric Davidovich became one of the biggest car YouTubers in Russia with over 4 million subscribers. The production team behind the documentary, likely operating under the channel Tar Rubin, now has over 1 million subscribers. The Need for Drive channel went dormant for years after Giorgi's death, but came back eventually. His friends rebuilt his BMW. They posted tributes, they continued making content, and they turned the Georgian drift scene into a legitimate media brand that makes millions of dollars. They did everything Giorgi was planning to do. They just lived long enough to see it happen. The hunt for Giorgi was never going to be a high-speed chase through Tbilisi with helicopters overhead and spike strips on the highway. It was always going to be paperwork, court dates, escalating fines, a legal system that was slow and inconsistent, but was finally paying attention to the guy who'd been embarrassing them on the international stage. And Giorgi died before that hunt could finish. Before we could find out if he'd end up in prison like Antonio Ginestri, the squeeze-bend street racer who got 5 years for filming himself racing through Miami. Before we could find out if he'd successfully transitioned to legitimate content like his friends did after his death. Before we could find out if Georgian authorities would make an example out of him or let him fade into obscurity. So what do you think? Was Giorgi a drift legend who just pushed it too far, or a reckless outlaw who got exactly what was coming? Drop your thoughts in the comments section. And if you love stories about people who take things way past the limit, hit that subscribe button.